This 1862 portrait appears peaceful, but zooming in on the slave's face reveals a disturbing detail. Dr. Megan Collins adjusted her glasses as she carefully examined the photograph from 1862. As the senior restoration specialist at the Atlanta Conservation Institute, she had worked with hundreds of historical images, but something about this one made her pause. The photograph showed the Blackwell family, a prominent plantation family from Georgia, posing for their annual portrait. Just another typical pre-Civil War image, she murmured to herself as she scanned the photograph to begin the digital restoration process. In the record, Richard Blackwell, the patriarch, stood stiff and proud. His wife Victoria sat in an ornate chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. Their 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, were arranged around them, all dressed in their finest clothing with solemn expressions, appropriate to the photographic customs of the era. In the background, almost imperceptible, a black man dressed as a house servant carried a tray of food. The photograph had been donated to the Institute as part of a collection of Civil War-era memorabilia from a recently deceased collector. According to the accompanying documentation, it had been acquired at an estate sale in the 1950s and had never been properly restored or examined by experts. In her laboratory at the Institute, Megan used specialized software to enlarge and enhance the image quality. While working on restoring water damage in the lower section, something caught her attention. She zoomed in on the face of the servant in the background. Wait a minute. Unlike the neutral or solemn expressions typical of 19th century photography, especially from enslaved people who rarely appeared in family portraits, the man had a subtle, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. It was discreet, contained, but unmistakably a smile. Megan frowned. In her 15 years of experience restoring historical photographs, she had never seen such an expression in a similar context. The era's long exposure times meant subjects typically maintained serious expressions, and enslaved people were almost never depicted showing any emotion at all. "Professor Wallace needs to see this," she said, printing an enlargement of the section. That night, while organizing her notes about the Blackwell photograph, Megan couldn't get that enigmatic smile out of her mind. There was something disturbing about it. Not joy, but something more complex and unsettling, something that seemed terribly out of place in the formal composition of a wealthy family's commemorative portrait. She pulled up the image on her computer again, studying the man's eyes. Behind that smile lay something intense, perhaps triumph, perhaps vengeance, that sent a chill down her spine. The Wilkes County Historical Records Library housed detailed documents about the region's prominent families. Megan spent the morning examining the Blackwell records, trying to find any information that might contextualize the photograph and its unusual detail. "Here," she finally murmured, her finger landing on a newspaper article from March 1862. "Tragedy strikes Blackwell family. Richard Blackwell, his wife Victoria, and their 4 children found dead at their estate. Food poisoning suspected." Beside Megan, the local archivist, Dr. Henry Johnson, watched with growing interest. A tall man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he had spent decades preserving the county's complicated history, including its painful chapters. "Found something significant?" he asked, noting Megan's intense focus. Possibly," she replied, showing him the enlarged photograph. "This image appears to have been taken shortly before their deaths. Look at the man in the background." Henry examined the image, his eyebrows rising as he noticed the smile. "A smile? That would be extremely unusual for the period, especially for an enslaved person in a formal portrait." "Exactly. And considering the family died soon after, supposedly from food poisoning." Henry nodded slowly, understanding the implication. "You're suggesting it wasn't accidental." He disappeared among the shelves, returning minutes later with a leather-bound record book protected in an acid-free sleeve. "This is the diary of the local physician, Dr. Thomas Harrington. He was called to examine the bodies." In the yellowed pages, Megan found a detailed entry. "Called to Blackwell Plantation. Entire family deceased. Symptoms consistent with severe poisoning. Dilated pupils, foam at mouth, apparent convulsions before death. The housemaid reported that only the family consumed the festive dinner. The house servant Samuel not found on property." "Samuel?" Megan repeated the name, looking again at the smiling man in the photograph. The diary contained more notes about the case. Apparently a search party was organized, but Samuel was never captured. The authorities presumed his guilt from his flight, but without concrete evidence beyond circumstantial factors, the case was eventually filed away as an unexplained tragedy. "Why would a photographer be present on that particular day?" asked Megan, trying to piece together the timeline. "According to these records," Henry replied, turning the pages of another ledger, "it was the Blackwells' 20th wedding anniversary. The photograph was commissioned as part of the celebration. The African American History Museum of Atlanta was located in an elegantly renovated historic building downtown. Dr. Eliza Washington, the principal curator and specialist in Georgia slavery history, examines the photograph with a grave expression. Her office walls were lined with books and framed historical documents, many focused on resistance narratives during the slavery era. "This case is fascinating, Megan. What have you discovered about the man?" she asked, studying the enlarged section showing the servant's face. "Only his first name, Samuel, and that he disappeared after the deaths. The authorities presumed his guilt, but they never found him. Eliza typed some information into her computer. Let's check our database of formerly enslaved people's narratives collected in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project. Many who escaped changed their names, but they often kept elements of their stories. After an hour of searching through digitized records, they found a transcript of an interview with a 97-year-old man named Samuel Freeman, recorded in 1933 in Chicago. While he never explicitly mentioned the Blackwells, there were revealing details that suggested a connection. "Listen to this," said Eliza, reading from the transcript. "When they sold my Esther and our 2 little ones down to Louisiana, something broke in me. Master had promised he would never separate families, but he broke his word when he needed money after gambling losses. That's when I knew justice wouldn't come from white men's laws." Megan felt a chill. "Is there any way to confirm this is the same Samuel?" "Maybe." Eliza scrolled down to another section. Here, he mentions having worked as a personal house servant for a plantation family in Georgia, and having found his way north through the Underground Railroad after an incident in 1862. He never specifies what incident, and the interviewer didn't press. Reading further, they found another revealing passage. "There was a photographer there that day. I remember thinking it was fitting that there would be a record, that everything would be documented for history to judge." Megan and Eliza exchanged intense looks. The connection was undeniable. "Is there anything about what happened to him afterward?" asked Megan. "According to this document, he settled in Chicago, remarried, had 3 children, became a respected carpenter and later a community activist. Died in 1935, never returning to the South." Eliza paused. "He never explicitly confessed to any crime in these interviews, but reading between the lines, the Blackwell Mansion had been converted into a small historical museum decades ago." Megan walked through the restored rooms, observing the period furniture and family portraits on the walls. The guided tour provided the standard narrative about the noble Southern family and their contributions to the region. "Are there specific records about the enslaved people who worked here?" Megan asked the tour guide, an elderly lady with a strong Southern accent and a pearl necklace that she fingered nervously at the question. "We have some accounting books in the archive," she replied, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "But the focus of our collection is the Blackwell family proper." In the small museum archive, Megan found the mentioned financial records. Between lists of supply purchases and cotton sales were cold records of property, people bought and sold as commodities, their humanity reduced to monetary value. In an entry from October 1861, sale of 3 slaves to Trader Davis, woman 28, boy 6, girl 4. Total received $200. There were no names, only ages and values. But a marginal note said, "Samuel informed after transaction, restless but submissive." In earlier records, Megan found references to Samuel and Esther, breeding pair acquired in 1855, and later the birth of 2 children, a boy in 1856 and a girl in 1858. A December 1861 entry was particularly revealing. Samuel exhibiting concerning behavior, found reading newspaper in kitchen, punishment administered, to be kept under observation. And then, in February 1862, just weeks before the tragedy, Samuel appears to have accepted his station again, exemplary behavior, particularly attentive to family meal preparation. Megan felt a chill run down her spine as she connected this entry with what she already knew about the family's demise. In another section, she found a mention of the planned celebration. Photographer Wilson hired for family portrait on wedding anniversary, March 1862. Special dinner to follow, Samuel to prepare and serve favorite dishes. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture as clear and disturbing as the photograph itself. A man who had lost everything, methodically planning his revenge against those who had destroyed his family. Professor Wallace, a historical toxicologist at the University of Georgia, carefully analyzed the descriptions of symptoms recorded by Dr. Harrington in his examination of the Blackwell family. Based on these accounts, we're likely dealing with a toxic plant. The dilated pupils, spasms, and rapid death suggest a powerful alkaloid compound, possibly belladonna, henbane, or jimsonweed, all plants that grew in the United States at that time and contain powerful anticholinergic compounds. Would these have been easily accessible? Asked Megan, taking notes. Absolutely. Knowledge about medicinal and toxic plants was commonplace in the 19th century. Many enslaved people brought extensive botanical knowledge with them from Africa. Additionally, they were often responsible for tending the medicinal gardens on plantations. The irony is that many plantation owners relied on enslaved people for health care and medical knowledge. Wallace opened an antique botany book from his collection. Here's something interesting. Jimsonweed, or apple of Peru, was known among enslaved communities as the rebellious slave's herb, as there were documented cases of its use to poison plantation owners. It grew wild throughout the South. Das gibt's. And would it be difficult to detect in food? If prepared properly, the extract could be relatively discreet, especially in heavily spiced foods common in Southern cuisine. The initial symptoms would resemble alcohol intoxication or common illness. By the time more severe symptoms appeared, it would be too late. Megan considered this information. How long would it take to act? With a sufficient dose, symptoms would appear within an hour, death within a few hours. It would be quick, but not instantaneous. The victims would experience confusion, hallucinations, rapid heartbeat, and eventually respiratory failure. This explained the interval between the celebratory dinner, where the photograph was taken, and the deaths discovered later that night. Is there any way to confirm this theory? Were the bodies exhumed? Wallace shook his head. Unfortunately not. According to the records, the family was buried quickly due to the heat and the nature of the deaths. No formal autopsy beyond Dr. Harrington's visual examination. That was common practice at the time, especially for wealthy white families who would want to avoid scandal. So we'll never know with absolute certainty, concluded Megan. Not scientifically, but the convergence of circumstantial evidence is compelling. A search through Atlanta's historical archives revealed that the photographer responsible for the Blackwell image was named Edward Wilson, an itinerant professional who traveled throughout the South, documenting wealthy families. Fortunately, Wilson kept meticulous diaries of his work, now preserved in a private collector's collection. After a series of emails and a persuasive video call, the collector, Mr. Jameson, agreed to digitally share the relevant pages from Wilson's diaries. He transmitted high-resolution scans the following day. March 17, 1862. Contracted for Blackwell family photograph commemorating their wedding anniversary. Arrival scheduled for 4 p.m. before the festive dinner. Weather cooperative, good light for portraiture in the main parlor. So far, nothing they didn't already know, but the entry continued. Session proceeded normally, though I noticed unusual tension. The house servant, a man of typically serious countenance, according to Mrs. Blackwell, seemed strangely serene today. I commented on this privately to Mr. Blackwell, who mentioned a recent disciplining that apparently corrected his rebellious attitude, completed the portrait as they prepared for dinner, declined invitation to join them, citing another appointment in Madison. That last line sent chills down Megan's spine. The photographer had refused to participate in exactly the meal that would kill the entire family. The entry from the following day was even more revealing. March 18th. Shocking news about the Blackwells. Entire family found dead this morning. Authorities suggest spoiled food, but there are whispers about the missing servant. I distinctly recall his look as he served dinner. There was something unsettling about his serenity. Perhaps this is imagination stimulated by the events, but it seems significant now. Declined to discuss my observations with the sheriff, as they seemed too subjective to be of use in a formal investigation. Wilson had also noticed Samuel's behavior, but hadn't understood its significance until it was too late. A final note added, Blackwell portrait will remain undelivered. I consider it inappropriate to present to distant relatives under the circumstances. Have filed it with my personal collection instead. This explained how the photograph had survived. Separated from family collections, it had eventually made its way to the collector who donated it to the Atlanta Conservation Institute over 160 years later. He saved it? Megan murmured. He must have understood later what he had captured. The conference room at the Conservation Institute was covered with notes, photographs, and documents. Megan had assembled a detailed timeline board connecting all the elements of the story they had uncovered. Professor Wallace and Dr. Washington had joined her to review the complete case, each bringing their specialized expertise to the analysis. Let's recap, said Megan, using a laser pointer to highlight key documents on the board. Samuel and Esther, an enslaved couple, are purchased by the Blackwells in 1855. They have 2 children over the next few years. In October 1861, Esther and the children are sold without warning, despite a previous promise to keep families together. This happens shortly after Richard Blackwell suffers gambling losses. A tragically common pattern, commented Eliza. Promises made to enslaved people were routinely broken when financial interests arose. Family separation was one of slavery's most brutal aspects, and one of the most effective methods of control. Megan continued. In December, Samuel is punished for reading a newspaper, likely trying to gather information about his family's whereabouts or possibly about the progressing civil war. Then he apparently resigns himself, becoming exemplary in the weeks leading up to the family's death. Classic behavior of someone planning an escape or revenge, observed Wallace. The false submission to lower the captor's guard. They would interpret his compliance as successful breaking of his will. And then, the wedding anniversary dinner in March 1862. Samuel prepares and serves the meal, likely containing extract from a toxic plant. The photographer captures the moment, including Samuel's subtle smile. Hours later, the entire family is dead and Samuel has disappeared. Eliza examined the photograph enlargement again. This smile, it's not one of joy, but of resolution, of someone who is finally taking control of their destiny, no matter the cost. And years later, concluded Megan, a man named Samuel Freeman tells parts of his story to an interviewer, carefully omitting specific details but mentioning an incident in 1862 and the meaningful presence of a photographer. A story of personal justice, vengeance, and the high price of freedom, reflected Wallace, and all captured in a single image. What's particularly striking, added Eliza, is that Samuel chose a method that allowed him to be present for their deaths, yet escape before being caught. He wanted to witness the consequences of his actions, to see justice delivered by his own hand. Megan now faced a significant ethical dilemma. How to present this discovery to the public? The photograph technically documented the moment before a crime, an act of vengeance that, while understandable in the context of slavery's atrocities, had resulted in the deaths of 6 people, including 4 children. She met with the Institute's leadership to discuss the case. The wood-paneled conference room felt particularly solemn as they grappled with the implications of their findings. "Well, we have conflicting responsibilities here," explained the director, Dr. Marcus Reed, a distinguished historian with decades of experience navigating controversial historical topics. On one hand, a commitment to historical truth. On the other, concerns about how this narrative will be interpreted in the current political climate. "We're essentially revealing an unsolved murder," added Dr. Patricia Silva, head of ethics, although everyone involved has been long dead. Eliza, who had been invited as a consultant, advocated for a straightforward approach. "This photograph represents a vital counter-narrative to the sanitized history of slavery that has dominated for too long. It shows the agency of an enslaved man confronting unspeakably horrible injustice. To hide this would be to perpetuate erasure." "I agree," said Megan firmly. "We're not glorifying violence, but contextualizing an act of extreme resistance against a system that was itself brutally violent. Samuel had his entire family torn away from him for profit, his humanity systematically denied at every turn. The children, though," Dr. Silva noted quietly, "they were innocent participants in this tragedy. As were the countless enslaved children sold away from their parents," countered Eliza. "The very children Samuel lost. This is precisely the moral complexity we must not shy away from." After hours of deliberation, they reached a consensus. They would present the photograph and their findings as a complete historical case study with all necessary context about the realities of slavery, family separation, and the limited options available to enslaved people seeking justice within a system designed to deny it to them. "We'll present it as a complex document of resistance," concluded Dr. Reed, "neither celebrating the act itself nor judging it by contemporary standards, but understanding it within the terrible realities of that time and place." Megan nodded. "History isn't comfortable, nor should it be." "This isn't just about one man's act of vengeance," added Eliza. "It's about making visible the impossible choices faced by millions of enslaved people and recognizing their full humanity, including their capacity for both suffering and retribution." 6 months later, the exhibition, Captured Resistance, the Blackwell Photograph, opened at the African American History Museum of Atlanta. The main gallery featured an enlarged, restored version of the photograph, with special lighting highlighting Samuel in the background, his subtle smile now clearly visible to visitors. Around the central image, carefully designed panels meticulously detailed every aspect of the story: the Blackwell family records, the sale of Esther and her children, excerpts from the photographer's diary, and information about Samuel Freeman's later life in Chicago. A special section explained the realities of enslaved families being separated, with statistics and other documented stories showing how common this practice was throughout the South. In the corner, a glass case displayed period botanical books open to pages describing the toxic plants that Samuel likely used, alongside information about the medical and botanical knowledge held by enslaved communities. On opening night, the museum was packed with visitors. Journalists, academics, and the general public slowly circulated through the panels, absorbing the complex narrative. "We're not romanticizing violence," Eliza explained to a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "We're contextualizing an extreme act of resistance within the incredibly violent system that provoked it. This photograph captures a moment of terrible clarity, when one man decided that if justice couldn't be found within the system, he would deliver it himself." Megan observed visitors' reactions. Some appeared shocked, others thoughtful, many visibly moved. The exhibition had touched a nerve, challenging simplified narratives about both slavery and resistance. An elderly woman approached her, leaning on a cane. "My name is Ruth Freeman," she said softly. "Samuel was my great-grandfather." Megan was momentarily speechless. "You knew about this?" Ruth shook her head. "Not the specific details, just vague family stories about how he escaped from Georgia during the war, about how he never spoke of his first family." She looked at the photograph. "But we always knew he carried a great sorrow, and that he found his freedom through desperate means." She gently touched the image of her great-grandfather. "I don't judge what he did. I cannot imagine his pain. May I ask, how do you feel seeing this exhibition?" Ruth considered for a moment. "I feel that finally he can be seen, truly seen, not just as a victim, not just as an avenger, but as a complete human being making an impossible choice in an impossible situation. There is something powerful in having the full story told at last." 1 year after the exhibition opened, Megan sat in her office reviewing the outcomes of her work. The Blackwell photograph had become a case study in universities across the country, generating intense debates about resistance to slavery, historical justice, and how societies remember acts of violence on both sides of oppressive systems. Some conservative critics had denounced the exhibition as glorification of murder, while others argued that it presented a necessarily complex view of slave resistance. The Wall Street Journal had run an op-ed condemning the museum for celebrating an act of domestic terrorism. while the New York Times had praised it as unflinching historical reckoning. Historians generally praised the contextualized, multifaceted approach. Most notably, descendants of Samuel Freeman had come forward. Not just Ruth, but dozens of others. They shared family stories, photographs, and documents that filled in gaps in the narrative about his later life in Chicago. It was discovered that Samuel had become an active member of Chicago's black community, an advocate for education for black children, and eventually a participant in the nascent civil rights struggle. He never spoke about his life as an enslaved person, but kept a locked box containing a small locket that, according to family lore, had belonged to Esther. On Megan's desk was a copy of a recently published article in the Journal of American History, analyzing the case. The title perfectly captured the essence of her discovery: Samuel's Smile, Agency, Resistance, and the Enduring Power of a Single Image. The last page of the article reproduced another photograph, this one of Samuel Freeman at age 70, surrounded by his second family in Chicago in 1910. His face, now aged and marked by time, was serene. His eyes, however, still carried the weight of all he had lived through and lost. A letter had arrived just yesterday from the Smithsonian, requesting to include the Blackwell photograph in a major upcoming exhibition on resistance narratives throughout American history. The image would stand alongside other documented acts of resistance, from slave revolts to civil disobedience. For Megan, the two photographs together told a story that transcended words, of unspeakable pain, of impossible choices, and of the endless human quest for freedom and justice, no matter the cost. She gently closed the article. Some historical secrets, once revealed, could not be forgotten, nor should they be. Samuel's silent act of resistance, captured forever in that enigmatic smile, had finally taken its place in the complex tapestry of American history, not as a simple tale of heroes and villains, but as a testament to the full, complicated humanity of those the system had tried to render merely as property.